The African Union has been spearheading various initiatives to bring together their member states. One of them is the Continental Free Trade Agreement, which Namibia has finally agreed to. The other angle that the AU is taking to strengthen regional unity and build Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's dream of an Africa for all Africans is a decade of promoting human rights. Recently, senior producer at One Africa Television Alna Dall attended the AU's Continental Civil Society and Media Consultation on the draft 10-year action plan of the Human and People's Rights Decade in Africa. Dall joins us in studio to discuss the efforts of the AU in promoting human rights, the perception of the AU in Africa, and the responsibility placed upon the shoulders of all media practitioners to make the 10-year action plan on promoting human rights a reality. Good evening, viewers, and a warm welcome to One Exclusive. My name is Joseph Shifeni. Joining me in studio this evening is a very special guest. She goes by the name of Alna Dall. Now, Alna used to be the presenter of One Exclusive. Alna, so great to have you. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe.
To start things off, don't you miss being on the show?
Yeah, you stole the show from me, actually, didn't you? For the viewers who don't know, One Exclusive was my brainchild back in the day, but I think you're doing a much better job.
Getting into the topic at hand, but before we get to the AU and the human rights in Africa, can you tell us about the involvement of One Africa Television in the AU's draft 10-year action plan?
Okay, we were invited, well, I went on behalf of One Africa and on behalf of civil society to a conference in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso on the 10th and 11th of May. We were invited as the media, there were civil society organizations there to consult and give input on the draft action plan for the AU's 10 years of promoting human and people's rights in Africa. To give you a bit of background, in 2016 in Kigali, Rwanda, the AU heads of state decided that from 2017 until 2026, we will have a decade of promoting human rights in Africa. That same year in September, they approached the Pan-African Lawyers Union, which is an NGO run by Donald Daya. It's based in Kenya. And him together with, I think it's 10 other consultants, mostly from Tanzania, Kenya, and Nigeria, got together to engage with both the AU organs as well as the regional economic communities. Now, the regional economic communities would be like the SADC. The equivalent of that in West Africa would be ECOWAS. So they sat since September last year until now, they have been engaging to come up with this action plan. How are we going to promote human rights on this continent for the next decade? And that's where we came in. We were invited as a panelist to come into the conference and give our input. And there were so many civil society organizations. I do feel the media representation was a little bit weak, particularly from the private media sphere. There were a lot of government, state organ, voices there. So I think they could have done a little bit better than that. And I think there were only 2 or 3 at my conference, members from the SADC. So there were pitfalls in, I think, the delegates that were there, but it was definitely a good starting point. If you like, I can tell you about the pillars of this decade.
Yes, please.
Okay. So basically, Donald Daya said, with this action plan, there will be 5 pillars. Now, the first is to instill a culture of human rights in Africa. Very easy. I mean, do we know what our rights are? Do you know what power there is in voting and the fact that you have free and fair elections? I think the culture of human rights is also to give the African, dignity, which was stolen from it during colonial oppression. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar, which is really the one that's become a lot more controversial, and we can talk about it, is the protection of human rights across the continent. The third pillar would be coordinating human rights institutions on the continent. Now, if we look at human rights institutions, which human rights institutions in Namibia do you know of?
NAM rights?
NAM rights. There's a Namibia Human Rights Commission, and not all of them are necessarily government organs, but they are essential in that independence that they carry. So then the fourth pillar would be strengthening these institutions. So the AU is not saying, you know what, let's just promote human rights. Let's see how we can strengthen national institutions on the ground to represent the people's voices. The fifth pillar is also a bit more controversial, and we'll talk about it, is their flagship interventions. Now, the AU, the first flagship intervention is free movement of all Africans across borders. Anyone familiar with the AU knows that this is not a new concept. This comes from Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's dream of a United States of Africa. But again, with the perception of the AU that it's a little bit washy. I'm not sure why they put it in the 10-year action plan, but it's obviously something the AU feels very strongly about. The second flagship intervention is nationality, that every African should have a nationality. Now, with the diaspora that we're facing across the continent, with the migration crisis in Europe, this is an important thing, again, to restore dignity. The fourth flagship intervention would be transformative leadership. So the AU is not just looking at human rights, making everyone aware of them, but making sure that the leaders of the countries, the African Union heads of state, are instilling a sense of human rights in that leadership structure. The final flagship intervention is a bit more practical, where the AU is actually asking that we step up and we help them finance this decade. So that's pretty much the action plan in a nutshell.
Now we're going to go for a short commercial break, after which we continue discussions on the AU draft 10-year action plan. Welcome back. We continue discussions with Alna Dall. I see here that you are saying that the plan mainly focuses on making Africans aware of their human rights, but we still see rights violations such as slavery, child labor, and so on.
You know, this is a very interesting point you raised, Joseph, and it was probably one of the biggest critiques. I have to say, sadly, that I was the most dissident voice, and my opinion wasn't always accepted. But that's where this perception of the African Union comes in, and it's a very important thing to touch upon. The African Union often steps back and says, you know what, we've only got soft power, we need to build an inclusive Africa, and we need to empower states that aren't necessarily democratic in order to get there. But you, as much as I know, that you cannot really instill universal human rights if there's not democracy in every country. I mean, how are you going to uphold universal rights if you have a religious tyranny? I, as a Christian, I believe in, religion shouldn't be involved in universal rights. There should be universal rights that we all uphold, that we all find valuable, regardless of our background and tradition. So the AU has been criticized for not putting enough pressure on its member states. I mean, if you look at Eritrea and Chad, DRC, activists who have tried to hold peaceful demonstrations. In Togo, for instance, journalists have been locked up. They've been facing military court trials because they were dissident voices to government. They were dissident voices to corruption. So again, the big thing with the plan here is if you're going to want to get everyone to buy in, you also need to be critical of your own structure. The AU in 2008, Kofi Annan, the UN, with the delegate of AU heads of state, put pressure on Kenya to sign a peace treaty, and they brought peace in a time with there could have been violent elections and violent upheavals, but they stepped in and they put pressure on the Kenyan government and its people to hold each other accountable to peace. So that is a big thing that you brought up there. How are we going to promote human rights if we're not all on the same page when it comes to its importance? It's the same thing with opening borders. How do you open borders between Morocco and a neighboring state that's democratic? How are you going to stop an influx of immigrants, people who are maybe not happy with an oppressive form of governance, who want something new, who want to be a part of a democracy? So those little things we should touch upon, but I don't think it should break away from the dream. And if you like, I can go into the dream of the AU as well later.
I see here what you're saying is that the AU was criticized at the platform for being toothless, especially at times of crisis on the continent.
You know what, Joe, what stood out for me so much, I'm not an expert on the African Union, but there's one thing that Ambassador Sali, the Air Ambassador Sali, said that really stood out for me, is that if you are born in Africa, or if you are married to an African, you are a member of the African Union. We do often, it does feel like South Africa is in a bit of a utopia, you know, the untouchable SADC. And we can see it with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, where, you know, it felt like they wouldn't have power. They had 44 signatures, but because the Nigerian and South African and Namibian, well, not Namibian as much, governments haven't signed it yet, it kind of felt like it was powerless. And this is a perception we need to change, not just the AU. Regarding the criticisms of the action plan, it was interesting to see the AU holding civil society organizations accountable and saying, you are losing political will. We used to be able to rely on you to keep leadership accountable, to stop them from, you know, acting out corrupt agendas. Where is your political will? And on the other hand, you had these civil society organizations saying, our space is shrinking. It's becoming harder and harder to survive as civil society organizations. And economics come into play here, because as our economies grow as African states, the World Bank pushes us into the next tier, and before we know it, we're losing donor funding. Because, you know, countries we used to rely upon, like Namibia, we rely upon Finland, America, and Germany. Without them, civil society organizations would have to stand begging for scraps from government's table. So there is a perception thing that needs to change, and I think it slowly is changing, especially that relationship between the organizations on the ground upholding human rights and the AU, who is protecting its member states that aren't upholding human rights.
Right. Still on the perceptions, how does the perceptions that you just mentioned affect the implementation of the 10-year action plan?
The perceptions are only going to change if we force them to. I think the AU has taken some considerable steps that we cannot gloss over, the AU passport, for instance. And it's such a beautiful initiative to restore dignity and to, you know, even eradicate trade barriers between countries. But there are still, I mean, most of our immigration officers, if you give them an AU passport, they'd say, what is this? You know, so you have diplomats using these passports that we haven't given power yet. So the perception of the AU is going to be a tricky one to marry with selling human rights on the continent, simply because we haven't set a benchmark for democracy. Until the AU, and I think we do need to, this is where our responsibility comes in, we need to instill this stuff here in order for us to open borders. So we need to not focus on that country that's not doing what it should do. We need to focus on how are we strengthening our human rights in order for this decade to work.
And have we actually been seeing that happening? Has it been doing that, the AU?
I think it's difficult to get so many people with different ideologies together. I think the AU is doing a good job. I don't think it's always very self-reflexive with its own institutions. It's very bureaucratic in a way that I've got a list of 30 ratified treaties that should affect my daily life as an African. But it doesn't, because it's a piece of paper. So, but again, we are all members of the AU. We can't be criticizing a body we're a part of. Our perception in order for this plan to change is that we are a part of this plan. It is our plan collectively.
It starts here.
It starts here.
We're going to go for another short break. Stay tuned. Welcome back to One Exclusive. I'm still joined in studio by Alna Dall, talking to us about her participation in a recent conference by the AU in Ouagadougou, Burkina Faso. How can Namibians get involved, in the promotion of human rights in Africa?
That's a good question. I think let's start with the role players. They've put a lot of emphasis on the youth. They've put a lot of emphasis on mass communication and on activists. I don't feel Chapter 8 of the draft plan, where the mass communication model comes in, I think was a little bit weakly written. I don't think there was enough input by media. But this creates an opportunity for us to step up and say, you know what, we're here. Let's talk about the type of content we as media are going to create to persuade people to uphold their own human rights. Let's talk about the target audiences. Every Namibian has a cell phone. Every Namibian, I think it's a penetration into the informal sector is about 85% of every informal business sector owner has a cell phone. Every time that you see somebody is, transgressing a basic human right, it is your job to call the media. It is your job to inform us as watchdogs. It is our jobs as watchdogs to make sure that every single human rights transgression does not go unnoticed. My biggest example, I think, is shack demolitions. And this is something that touches me to my core. Because what we are seeing is City of Windhoek bylaws are trumping your constitutional right to movement and housing, your right to life. You cannot just tear people's shacks down. It's unconstitutional. There is a law that says you can, but it was a law written by an apartheid regime that didn't care for the right to life. So we need to educate ourselves on what are our constitutional human rights. Do you know all your human rights, Joseph?
Sort of.
I think some of us it's instilled, but I think there are a lot of people who are stuck in, basic right to dignity. There are women who are strong, powerful figures, but then they go home and they are paraded naked in front of men at a cultural festival. And there is this dichotomy of beliefs and understanding of rights in the African that we need to address. And we can't hold on to both. Somewhere we have to let go of harmful traditions, and we have to embrace democracy and human rights, universal human rights, to its fullest.
One of the topics I wanted to touch with you on is the implementation of the Continental Free Trade. Can you tell us about that? Was it discussed?
Yes, you know what? I really actually also have to give credit to the consultants, because this is a tough space. A lot of, representing women's organizations as well, beside my work here at One Africa. I know that once we have a voice, we feel that this is the time to just let it all out. So a lot of the conference was civil society organizations expressing their frustration with international organs, their frustration with government, their frustration with corruption. And the Pan-African Lawyers Union, Donald Daya in particular, was so open to listening to what every single person has to say. And they are working these recommendations in. You must remember it's a 10-year plan. It's a huge thing. It's millions of people you're talking about that you want to get a message to. The plan itself does not have a timeline of implementation. And this is where the AU wants all of us to step up and to promote what we think will work in our nation states. We know the land expropriation, resettlement, urban housing crisis, the rights of the women. The rights of the women is something that the AU has now made an international mandate. But the other things that are closer to home, there's not a court specific to land expropriation, because it's not a specific thing that all African countries suffer from right now. So again, it is our responsibility to make it happen as far as implementation is concerned.
African human rights systems, how does the AU want to coordinate them?
I think the first starting point is awareness. That the human rights systems that we have, new organizations that are coming up fighting for rights of minorities, are you telling the AU I exist? If we don't talk to each other between regions, how many SADC human rights, we were trying to establish who represents the rights of journalists in Southern Africa. And the only name I could come up with was the Media Institute of Southern Africa. And there are countless others. So the first thing with coordination is stepping up and making the AU aware of yourself and making yourself aware of the AU organs. We have courts, we have African courts that you can take your government to. If there's an issue of nationality, there's the AU Advisory Board on Corruption. Did you know about that? No. There is the Peace and Security Council. So there are organs that we can use, but we don't educate ourselves. And I would like to urge every single viewer, if you have a cell phone, you know the campaign hashtag Fees Must Fall in South Africa. You know the hashtag North African Spring or the Spring Uprisings. How much power is in your hand? Human rights are yours. It's yours to own it. And the AU is yours because you are a member.
Alna Dall, any closing remarks from your side?
I'm just eternally grateful to be a part of this process. And I'd like to say One Africa Television is now an official broadcast partner for this plan. So if there's anything you'd like, if there's content you want to give us, if there's a plan, if there's an event that you are doing to promote human rights, let us know. We are in contact with the right people, with the consultants. If there's a part of the implementation you want to be responsible for, come to me. Tell me I'm at One Africa. I'll let the AU know, and we'll make it happen.
Alna, thanks so much.
Thanks, Joe.
All right. And with that, we have come to the end of the show. Thanks so much for watching. And be sure to share this with us on our social media pages. From me, Joseph Shifeni, it's goodbye.